So who is Gwendolyn from Tides of Annihilation? Because to me, she doesn't seem like she's just some random protagonist. For those of you who are not aware, Tides of Annihilation presents Gwendolyn as the lone survivor of London's collapse, but her role immediately feels larger than survival alone. She is the one character capable of commanding spectral knights tied directly to Arthurian legend, which strongly suggests she is connected to the myth on a deeper level. In Arthurian storytelling, names are rarely accidental. A name often carries legacy, bloodline, prophecy, or thematic purpose. Because of that, Gwendolyn is likely meant to echo older Welsh and author-adjacent feminine names such as Guinevere. This matters because the game may be signaling that Gwendolyn is not simply surviving the legend, she may be inheriting it. So already there are multiple questions that can be presented about who this character is and what what role this protagonist will play once you start playing Tides of Annihilation. And one of which questions could be, why would the only survivor of this post-apocalyptic London-based world be the only person who can command these round table spectral knights? That in and of itself, that arouses suspicion, and that only serves to bolster the direction which the story could go and how engaged the gamer will be once you get into the world. Her design feels less like a civilian survivor and more like someone chosen by an older system, someone who has been predetermined to fulfill some sort of larger purpose. That's what Gwendolyn feels like when it comes to Tides of Annihilation. And another thing about this particular character is that her name sounds regal in nature. Gwendolyn. It sounds like she belongs to a monarchy, which are comprised of kings and queens. So that automatically allows me to assume, okay, this character must be outlined for some higher purpose, as I've been saying. And I think that that's something that we will see in this game, not only because she's a protagonist, but because based off of who this character could be portraying in Arthurian legend and how they're portraying her to be depicted in the game, that can allow the gamer to assume, okay, you're not just going to be some casual survivor of this post-apocalyptic world. You're going to be someone who is of actual merit and of import. So that only leads into the next question. Who is Gwendolyn mythologically? Who is she in Arthurian legend? Now, Gwendolyn is not a direct, fixed Arthurian character in the same way Guinevere is, but the name draws heavily from Welsh mythic naming traditions that influence Arthurian literature. Guinevere, author's queen, comes from the Welsh name Gwenhwyfar, a name associated with beauty, nobility, and tragedy. In many retellings, she becomes one of the central causes of Camelot's downfall through her relationship with Lancelot. Because Tides of Annihilation uses the name Gwendolyn instead of Guinevere, the game may be creating a spiritual successor rather than a literal adaptation. This would let the writers preserve the emotional symbolism of Camelot's queen without retelling the exact same role. So effectively, what Gwendolyn potentially could be is a modern Guinevere parallel, whereas it's said in the mythology, Gwendolyn, who is known mythologically as Guinevere, she is responsible for, well, in part, to the downfall of Camelot, due in large part due to her interactions with Lancelot. Well, you probably could assume that the synopsis and the story and narrative of this game could go in the direction as if the protagonist is actually one of the contributing factors as to why the London that's depicted in this game is shown in ruins. Perhaps she is someone who is fighting against the very forces that she might have had an influence in causing. Another piece of speculation that could be equally interesting is the fact that Gwendolyn, she could be a reincarnation of Guinevere. She could be her descendant. She could even be her narrative replacement. But those are just various different routes that the directors and the devs can take the game in, which only furthers to deepen the plot and the play engagement in the story. So in a way, the game may be asking what happens when Camelot's feminine archetype survives into the modern world. And while Gwendolyn may not be Guinevere by name, she seems to potentially carry that same narrative burden. However, now let's discuss the Camelot Curse. Now, what is that? The curse, it's not always a literal curse in Arthurian legend. Instead, it refers to the inevitable collapse built into Camelot's existence. So my interpretation of that was that this is the equivalent to Ragnarok in Norse mythology, how it's the pre-outlined, foretold destruction of Norse culture in the world as they know it in that world. So I just assumed that this was synonymous with that, but for Arthurian legend. And Camelot represents the ideal kingdom: courage, honor, loyalty, justice, and unity. However, the myth teaches that even the perfect kingdom contains the seeds of its own destruction. And when I say destruction of the world as it's known, the fall of that world, it comes through things like betrayal, forbidden love, pride, prophecy, a destiny that is unavoidable. You know, the same usual shit. And this, ironically, is why Camelot is tragic. Its greatness is what makes its collapse unavoidable. It would seem that the biggest of titans and the biggest of empires, it's almost as if it's predetermined that, hey, someday you're not going to be here. Think of Rome, think of any great empire or civilization. It's like their collapse is foretold, even if you don't say it verbatim. In Tides of Annihilation, shattered London may function as a modern Camelot, meaning Gwendolyn may be living inside the newest version of that same doomed cycle. So is Gwendolyn cursed and predisposed to repeat Guinevere's role and what Guinevere did in the past? That's where it gets tricky, because either direction serves as a feasible choice in order to continue the story and move the plot forward. I think if Gwendolyn isn't a representation of Guinevere and doesn't adhere to what Guinevere did in Arthurian mythos, that's fine, because essentially it's a new original title for people who are familiar with that legend. But I would argue that most people are not familiar with Arthurian legend. Me personally, my own experience comes from Sonic and the Black Knight, where there was Lancelot and Percival and all these other people who I knew about, I guess, just unironically, just in the back of my head, I guess, but they aren't something that I'm actually as knowledgeable about. I would argue that most gamers have more of a knowledge about things like Norse mythology, Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, but Arthurian legend, that's a new turn, and I think that would attract a lot of new gamers and a lot of new people who would be interested in this. So I think even if they did adhere to Gwendolyn maintaining what Guinevere did in the legend of Arthurian legend, it would still be fine and it would still be good for the story, because most people aren't familiar with it anyway. Like, is she the one who's meant to break the cycle instead of continuing the cycle? Maybe London itself is the new Camelot, and she is going to serve as its final queen, as the one who's going to take control of the monarchy, if that's the type of government and political structure that they have in place in this game. The curse of Camelot is not magic, it's the inevitability of ruin, that you cannot escape destruction. Something else to discuss is why she can control these spectral knights. The spectral knights are likely more than a gameplay mechanic. The PlayStation reveal specifically says the combat system is built around ideals like courage, loyalty, and honor. So that potentially means that the knights may represent the living virtues of Camelot itself. If Gwendolyn can summon them, then one of three things may be true. One of which could be that she has a bloodline connection to Arthurian royalty. So she's actually someone who's in the royal family in the legend. She could be acting as a new vessel for Avalon's will. Another thing is that she is outside the myth entirely, which is why the system bends toward her will and her frame. She's an outlier. The gray fog that she utilizes is one of her abilities in the game. You can read this in the PlayStation blog description and article about this game when it was first announced. That fog, it could be symbolic for mythic memory attaching itself to the only survivor. She's the only one who survives this legend. So that mythological lore, all that is one and the same with her, because she's the only tie towards it. So I think there could be a correlation between that. Another point is that her power could be less magic and more so that's the legend choosing a center, a force of which to gravitate around. So I have a theory, and that is that the knights do not serve Gwendolyn because she commands them. They serve her because the myth recognizes her. Arthurian stories are obsessed with return, Arthur returning, Avalon awakening, the Grail resurfacing, old sins repeating. So what if Gwendolyn is Camelot's answer to its own failure? Instead of reviving Arthur, the myth revives a new queen figure, someone who can take place and take charge in this new broken future world. Maybe that person is Gwendolyn. That would make her not the heir to the throne, not a chosen king, but the person meant to rebuild what the myth destroyed. She could essentially serve as the correction to Guinevere's tragedy. Instead of causing the fall, she may prevent it. Her survival itself, that may be the reason, that may be a sort of final test in the legend. The real story might be Camelot trying to redeem itself through her actions as the protagonist in this game. I think Gwendolyn's mystery works because she feels mythologically intentional. Her name echoes Arthurian queens, her powers connect her directly to Camelot's ideals, her world reflects the same cycle of inevitable collapse. Maybe the real mystery of Tides of Annihilation isn't who destroyed London, maybe it's why the legend chose Gwendolyn to survive it. I must also say that it feels pretty good to see a game like this come out, because it's not often that we receive a game that actually explores other mythologies. Everything wants to do Greek, everything wants to do Norse, and then a quick third option could be Egypt. There are even rumors that, the next God of War game may be Egypt based, but this is Arthurian mythos, something I literally know nothing about outside of a few prominent characters, and it's nice that the developers that a developer is exploring this as an option for a narrative because it's something that's so seldom done in the games industry. I think that there's just been such a shift towards the transactional nature of business and of the industry itself, which I get it. It runs on money, it runs on consumerism and people buying the products and adhering to the outlines and regulations of which developers and these companies have outlined. But at the same time, it just feels good when there's an effort being put in and when we are receiving things that are essentially worth our money. So it feels good to see something like that. And I think a game that explores this type of narrative is going to be a good option for us as gamers to pick up. And hopefully more developers, they'll follow suit and they'll play these types of games, and they'll create these types of games as well so that we can have more of a variety in terms of mythologically based games. And those are games that I really like to play. So I think a lot of people share that sentiment as well. I'm Harlem. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.